Hello there, and welcome back to another episode of Inside the Vault. This is episode number 55. I'm your host, Ryan Smith, and I have the pleasure with me, an analyst and contributor from PFF. You know him from the PFF College Football Show with Max Chadwick, who also was a previous guest on this show. Hear him on the Rich Eisen Show and some of the other places in which he also contributes daily, or not daily, weekly, and kind of whenever they ask him on. But he is Dalton Wasserman. Dalton, how's it going?
Fantastic. How are you doing today, Ryan?
I'm doing well. It's good to have you on. Let's just go ahead and jump right in. So, this is the Panthers podcast, but I'll be remiss if we just didn't start with the breaking news of the day. Obviously, Bill Belichick coming to UNC Chapel Hill, which is about 2 hours north of Bank of America Stadium in Charlotte. So Chapel Hill, North Carolina is now the suddenly hot topic of college football. And Panthers coach Dave Canales all of a sudden has a six-time Super Bowl champion in his backyard that he can literally call up on the phone or drive 2 hours north to get some advice. So thoughts on the hire of Bill Belichick to UNC, and then what does that mean for a guy like Dave Canales, a young head coach, first year as a head coach in this league, second year calling offensive plays, and how can he kind of be a mentor or guide, if you will, for lack of a better word, to Canales?
Yeah, no, I think as far as Canales goes, it's his first time as a head coach, and he's trying to build the team and figure out what this roster is going to look like to win on a week-to-week basis, which obviously is something the Panthers have struggled with lately. But I think as far as Belichick goes, it really is shocking to see him after all these years in the NFL now for the first time get into the college ranks, right? And I feel like my mind goes in so many different directions with this because I think it's more possible than ever, like with what we've seen from Deion Sanders in Colorado, for a coach to come in and turn a program around relatively quickly. Not that USC has been down in the dumps, but I don't think they've contended in the ACC lately like they thought they would have, right? And now in the era of NIL and transfer portal and being able to turn over a roster as quickly as, as some teams have, when you look at, in Indiana or Colorado and some of these teams that have had such success in the portal lately in acquiring talent, you can build a roster pretty quickly, right? And I think he, and now apparently they've hired Michael Lombardi as their GM for this thing at North Carolina. You've seen a lot of college teams do this. Andrew Luck now took a position like that at Stanford. You can start really building this thing like an NFL program. And if it's true that he had some 400-page report about his plan, he was really committed to taking this job, and he's got a plan to have success with it.
Yeah. Bryce Young, let's go here now, obviously transitioning to the Panthers. Obviously, the Panthers are 3-10. We know this season, unless a lot of things happen in the crappy NFC South, which somehow don't know how, but the Panthers are still alive for the playoffs, barely, because this division is so bad. But assuming that crazy scenario does not happen, Panthers, like you said, have been in close games the last 3 weeks. People thought Kansas City was kind of a fluke. Then they did it against Tampa. And then, oh, by the way, they almost did it in Philly, where they have a really good defense and are allowing 10.5 points a game if you take out garbage time touchdowns. So at the end of the day, Bryce has proven to be taking that next step, if you will, kind of a giant leap, if you will. I mean, it's night and day, Dalton, from where he was week 1 and 2, and even all of last season, minus the Green Bay game that everyone wants to reference. And now it's like these last 3-4 games, he is on a rocket ship ascending. If Panthers are a stock, you need to buy, because I think the Panthers are on their way up. So thoughts on Bryce's recent play? And then second part of it, were you a fan of him coming out of Alabama? What was your kind of thoughts on him coming out initially of college?
Yeah, we'll start at the beginning. I think it was hard not to be a fan of him coming out of Alabama, and obviously the size was a concern, but he proved he could make most every throw on the field. He had enough ability to improvise. I thought there was some kind of Russell Wilson, Deshaun Watson kind of improvisational skills to him, but I think the biggest thing is his field vision and his confidence, and for some reason for the first year and a half, we didn't see that. Now, as far as the last 6 games, I could go through a bunch of numbers that tell you the story, right? When you talk about being better in clean pockets and having more clean pockets to work with. I've liked the way this Panthers offensive line has played for most of the year. That's a big factor in it. Under pressure, better decisions, even when it comes to just throwing the football away and not putting it in danger. I think his confidence to make bigger throws over his last 6 games since week 8. He's got 16 big-time throws, which are the highest-graded throws on our scale. That's the 4th most in the NFL in that stretch. And I think what it all points to is confidence and belief in his abilities. And even at the NFL level, this is something that guys can lose, especially at quarterback, especially early in their careers, where they go, okay, I haven't produced my rookie year, my first year and a half or so. It's getting tough. Can I actually do this? It feels like he came back in this second stint this season and he believes in himself. He believes in his arm. He believes in his accuracy. He believes in his athleticism to make plays out on the move and take off running. And he believes, even though it's Adam Thielen and Xavier Legette and even David Moore and guys who you wouldn't consider prime receivers or prime receivers yet, he believes in his weapons, and he's throwing these balls into tighter windows with the belief that he can complete them. So I think any number that we talk about from here in with Bryce Young or what we've examined the last 6 games starts with just a greater confidence and a greater belief in himself. And I have to give a lot of credit to Dave Canales. I love this hire when they hired him, in the first place from Tampa. I thought he was a big part in why Baker Mayfield played a lot better in Tampa. And now you've got a similar situation where I need to improve Bryce Young's confidence while I'm improving this roster.
Yeah. Though Bryce was also, speaking of the receivers, second in dropped yards. So some of these drops have been obviously costly, like Xavier Legette, Adam Thielen, which the NFL robbed him of that touchdown in the Tampa Bay game. And then you've got the Kansas City catch as well. So a lot of different drops from his receivers letting him down over the last few games. But like you said, numbers don't tell the whole story. At the end of the day, the size wasn't a concern from a lot of people. It was more of, well, let's look at history. A quarterback with his size, because if you take the comparisons, right? Kyler Murray is 5'10", but he's jacked. He's fast. Bryce Young is not fast. Drew Brees, about 6 foot, but he was deadly accurate coming out of college, and he also had a little bit more mobility than Bryce as well. So Bryce is kind of a mix between those two, for lack of a better, two quarterbacks that came to the top of my head. And so he has a great arm. He's slippery is what I like to call him. And he did this all the time in Alabama. So I think a lot of the reasons people don't want to either give him credit or feel like he can succeed is because we haven't seen this type of quarterback succeed in the NFL before. Is that fair?
I think it's fair. I mean, Bryce Young is certainly an outlier when it comes to the size, and I think of Russell Wilson as well in this category. And Wilson's obviously a bit bigger than Bryce, but I think the two things that stand out among all of those guys, especially Wilson, that Young has is instincts and field vision. And those were the two things that, especially as he was improvising at Alabama, he had those things. There were certain throws that he made. And he goes, first of all, how did he even see it? And second of all, he does. There are times when he steps into it and he's feeling that confidence. He is that accurate. And I think he can do that, especially in Dave Canales' offense that runs with a lot of rhythm. And now I think sometimes that rhythm is thrown off because the Panthers don't have a ton of guys who consistently separate yet. They drafted Xavier Legette, who's not an elite separator yet, and maybe he can become that guy, or maybe they need another guy to throw in there. Maybe receiver is an option at the top of this draft when you talk about maybe a Tepper McMillan or a Luther Burden right at the college level. But I think earlier in the season, there was, again, just a lack of belief in the timing and the structural things in this offense. And when you don't believe as a quarterback, whether it's in your weapons or your blocking or yourself, a lot of bad things can happen. I think if you believe and the pass protection has been better lately, then you start talking about, okay, he can start doing those things we saw at Alabama. He did play with timing back then, but he also improvised, and his instincts were great, and his field vision was great. We're starting to see that more and more every single week. And again, so impressive that he's done it against defenses like Kansas City and Philadelphia, who we consider the elite, some of the elite defenses in the NFL.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing that I think people, and I think Jimmy Fowler of ESPN had this earlier today, David Tepper, who a lot of people consider a volatile owner, is finally stepping back a little bit and giving Dave Canales, giving Dan Morgan, the general manager for the Carolina Panthers, a larger leadership role within the organization. Essentially, Tepper is more hands off, and we all know he was anything but hands off for the last few years. So I think that also is playing a big role as well. And this is just my theory. I think Canales saw kind of what was happening in preseason and training camp. They gave Tepper a heads up. And like you said, credit Dave Canales. It wasn't a popular move by any stretch of the imagination, but now it's looking like the best thing that might have ever happened to Bryce Young, combined with the fact that, unfortunately, Andy Dalton got into the car wreck and everything was okay. But yet that opportunity, luck and opportunity meet, sometimes you got to things happen. And so Bryce rose to the occasion and is now taking advantage of that opportunity. And so I think that also plays a bigger factor in and of itself, is having someone like David Tepper kind of give people more, let the football people do the football, essentially. Give them the space and the autonomy to do what you hire them to do. And I think that is paying dividends as well.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's a big factor, and we've seen other teams that have this issue with their owner. The Panthers aren't the only one. We can name out some other teams who maybe their owners are a little too hands-on with it, but the football people on the ground are who they are. And something like, especially a situation as delicate as your franchise quarterback, hopefully, you're talking about there's certain things that you can't fix in-game, right? And there's fundamental things with footwork and even just seeing different coverages. And sometimes a guy just needs a breather, right? And Bryce Young, I think Dave Canales saw, okay, last year, clearly, there wasn't as much progress made as there should have been in a guy's rookie year, right? And understanding that we needed to take a step back and work on the fundamental aspects of the position, and then just getting Bryce thinking in a more positive manner about, okay, listen, this is how this offense works. This is your job, and you just have to go out there and execute it. And honestly, beyond that, go out there and play football, right? He was so instinctual at Alabama, and I think that goes throughout the entire team. When you have football players that go out there and think too much about what their owner thinks, what their GM thinks, what the head coach thinks, what the fans think, what everybody thinks about them all the time and what they're going to do wrong, well, then they're going to do something wrong because that's all they're thinking about, right? You almost have to manifest that positivity, and I think Canales is very good at that, right? It was the same way in Tampa last year. I was in the boat. Look, Tom Brady's gone. The roster is kind of a mess. They're going to be in last place in the South, and they go and win a division because of that positive kind of energy, and they just have a leader that believes in his players, and they just need everyone else to kind of step out of that space for a minute and let him build what he wants to build.
Yeah. You mentioned the NFL draft. Let's go there specifically, or maybe free agency. You mentioned some of the guys like a Ted McMillan, like a Luther Burgess from Missouri. I actually have the opposite opinion. I believe wide receiver is going to be a list of needs for the Panthers, but I believe in the top 7, the Panthers can go get a guy like a Mason Graham, like an Abdul Carter. Put Mason Graham next to Derek Brown, will feed families in the Carolinas. I mean, good gracious. Derek Brown's already one of the most underrated Panthers and defensive linemen in the entire league. And putting Mason Graham next to him, who I don't think has a lot of flaws at all, would be scary for the rest of the NFL. So thoughts on what the Panthers should do? We'll start there in the top 5 or top 4 is what they're currently at. But I personally think this pick's going to be more like top 10.
No, I agree. Look, I think defense, I think there will be an argument for a receiver, and it'll be interesting to see how their board shakes out. But you're absolutely right. There's some elite defensive talents in this draft, and you're talking about, if they want to be able to, get a Mason Graham, who's an elite defensive tackle. Abdul Carter might be the number 1 edge rusher. I think even in the secondary, if they felt really confident about a Will Johnson, also from Michigan at cornerback, I think, look, this Panthers team has big-time needs all over this defense. There's no question about it. If they spent their whole draft fixing this defense, I wouldn't even blame them, because you got a first-round receiver last year. You just signed Chuba Hubbard to an extension. You got some things to work with, right? It's unfortunate, the Jonathan Brooks injury, but Jatavion Sanders has been a good player at tight end. I think there are options, but I feel that absolutely it's perfectly justifiable to go, we need an elite defensive talent, because when Derek Brown is healthy, he's really the only one that they have, right? J.C. Horn is good. He's having a down year at corner, but they don't have enough elite defensive players. So a Mason Graham or an Abdul Carter would be a serious infusion of talent. I'm with you. I don't think there's not a whole lot of wrong answers as far as what to do that high in the draft, because I think there's a lot of different types of talent that could help the Panthers.
When it comes to the receiver, this is my theory. So if the Panthers go defense early in the draft, I think they need to hit a splash in free agency. So obviously the guy that people talk about is T. Higgins. We saw the other night with Joe Burrow on Monday Night Football talking about Jamar Chase and T and how maybe there's a chance they could all, stay in Cincinnati. So, let's assume that might be the case. And if T does stay around in Cincinnati for however they make it work up there, a name I want to throw out is Garrett Wilson. What if he gets traded from the New York Jets? He's going to probably request a trade this summer. Perhaps that's rumors floating around. Could the Panthers say, Garrett Wilson, come on down to Charlotte and you can come be Bryce's number 1 receiver? He wouldn't cost a lot, and that's at least a name that I just think makes a lot of sense. What say you?
It wouldn't cost a lot as far as cash, but it would cost something. It'd be about making the right trade, right? And how much
Correct.
the Jets are asking
yes, cash-wise, yes, I'm sorry.
Yeah, it would depend on what the Jets are asking for in a trade. And Garrett Wilson, he's a primetime player, and he's a guy who play inside, outside, terrific route runner, can make things happen after the catch. I mean, ideally in one package, he is everything the Panthers need in a receiver, right? I think you have a big and fast guy in Leggett. You've got a potential really good tight end in Jatavian Sanders, but Garrett Wilson's an explosive playmaker with terrific hands, and he's excellent after the catch. That would be the question is, would it be worth it to give up? What if the Jets asked for something like 2 first-round picks, maybe a 2026 and a 2027? Would that be worth it? Or can we find something like that or something comparable in the draft or build that as a unit on offense? Or like you mentioned, Panthers have a good amount of cap space to work with. Would we rather just go get T. Higgins and go that route and keep all the draft capital, right? I think these are the things that always get measured. The hypothetical trades are always fun. And you're right. Garrett Wilson would be a spectacular ad for this team, but it does come at an extra cost as opposed to a free agent or maybe of a draft pick there.
Yeah. Another receiver in the draft, if they go defense early and they want to get a receiver a little bit later, 2 off the top of my head, Tez Johnson from Oregon, speedster from the outside. And then a guy who actually played with Bryce Young at Louisville, Ja'Cory Brooks, who transferred from Alabama to Louisville, is someone who has history with Bryce, and it could be a later round receiver that would end up as a steal for the Panthers.
Yeah, no, I agree. Those are 2 really good football players. I got to watch Johnson this past week against Penn State over there in Indianapolis for the Big Ten title game. As classically just good a slot weapon as you could ask for, right? And a separator is certainly over the middle of the field. If you talk about Leggett being that outside threat and Johnson being the inside threat. Now, I think Ja'Cory Brooks is really good. And there is a factor where he's played with Bryce before, but he's another one, more of an outside threat. So if you want an outside vertical threat, Ja'Cory Brooks might be your guy. But inside, if you're looking for a slot weapon, then it might be a Tez Johnson, or I'll throw you another name. Xavier Restrepo from Miami is a spectacular football player too. Those might be the 2 best pure slot receivers in this draft. Both of them are awesome players, and kind of comes down to whoever's available and what your preference is. But I think you're right. Adam Thielen, he's been great in the slot the last couple of years, but eventually you got to get a little younger in that position. And those are a couple of guys who could help.
Yeah. Kyle Kennard from South Carolina, local kid here, is another name on the defensive side of the ball. If they decide to go receiver in the first round, maybe get him in the second round, is another name to watch. But switching gears, though, off the draft for just a few minutes, and we'll go back to it if we have time. When it comes to the Panthers this season, obviously the record-wise, we won't talk about that. But as a whole, what have you seen from not just Bryce, but from this Panthers team over the last 5 games that maybe we weren't seeing in the first 8? Is it Canales building that culture and the team is buying in? And is it just that simple? Or is it getting some of the injured guys back, especially on defense? Because Ajero Avero in the 3-4 scheme, people weren't sure about that last year or this year. Last year was good, but you had Derek Brown out there. You had some of these other guys out there that aren't out there right now. So what is the difference between this Panthers team playing right now versus what we've seen over the last first 8 games of the season?
So I think there's 3 goals with this season, and we knew the Panthers were very unlikely to be in playoff contention this year, right after firing another coach and kind of hitting another mini reset here. I think 3 things you wanted to see. 1, Dave Canales with the culture, like you mentioned, and imprinting that just essence of positivity onto this team, right? And I think I see there's a couple of teams late in the year that have been struggling that I look at and they're starting to quit. Right? The Panthers are not one of those teams. You really like that. I know they're 3-10, and it's tough to grind through a season like that. But the fact that Canales still has them playing hard against really good football teams and playing, honestly, for their talent level, really good football, that's encouraging. 2, the development of Bryce Young, as we've been talking about this whole time, the last 6 weeks since he's come back in as the starter, that's what you want to see out of him is he looks like a starting quarterback, and it makes every future decision so much easier. So you don't have to sit there and think about, well, should we replace him again and take a Cam Ward or a Shadur Sanders, or should we re-sign Sam Darnold or something like that again? Or, it makes it so much easier organizationally when you feel like, okay, we can at least try with this quarterback. And the third thing, the offensive line additions that they made in the offseason, the 2 guards, right? Robert Hunt and Damian Lewis. I really needed that to work. And it is working. It's worked for just about most of the year. Right now, they could still maybe improve at center. I think they've had 3 different centers play this year, but I really like at the other 4 spots what they've gotten. Ekwonu's getting better at left tackle. Lewis and Hunt are reliable inside. Taylor Moton's been reliable forever at right tackle. The fact that you have a good offensive line and hopefully a good quarterback and a head coach that has this culture in, those are 3 extremely important things. When you look at so many of the good teams around the league, those are the 3 things they have. Detroit has it. Philadelphia has it. Kansas City has it for the most part. Buffalo has those three things. Like that's what head coach, quarterback, offensive line. If you have those three things, you can start building the rest of the team around it. This is going to be a big offseason for this team in free agency, I should say, and in the draft, because you have those three things to build around, and now you can start building a winning team.
Yeah. And I think, what do you think, and you might have already said the answer to my question, the offensive line is something that I don't think gets talked enough about with this team, because it's very easy to say, well, you pay Robert Hunt $100 million and Damian Lewis a little less. Ike Ekwonu coming off a sophomore slump, and then, like you said, Austin Corbett wasn't coming off 2 consecutive years with injuries, and then unfortunately he gets injured again. Yeah, so it's easy to say, well, Panthers overpaid for Robert Hunt, and they overpaid for 2 guards, and they're guards, they're not, receiver. What are they doing? But you see the results. Bryce trusts the pocket. He trusts the weapons around him. He's not getting sacked 62.5 times like he did last year, and I think that is paying dividends. And so my question to you is, what are we not talking enough around the league when it comes to the Panthers? Is it simply just the offensive line play? Or is it more, no, Bryce Young is finally seeing what we saw out of Alabama as the number 1 pick? Because I'll raise you, people talk about last year with Bryce having no receivers, no help, no separation, bad coaching, bad scheming. Well, C.J. Stroud is doing a little bit similar of those things this year. Nico Collins was out for an extended period of time. He's now back, but running game with Joe Mixon's nice. But outside of that, Stroud's been struggling. The offensive line has regressed, and that's what Bryce faced all of last year. And so I think people are finally deciding to come around on maybe this Bryce Young guy is not as bad as we thought he was.
Yeah, no, I think, first of all, Young's path this season is very symbolic of what the Panthers have looked like, right? And the pass protection's been good the entire way. And what concerned me most about Young in his first 2 starts this season and struggling is that he was struggling in clean pockets, and he was getting a lot of clean pockets. The pass protection was immediately better with Lewis and Hunt in there at guard. Last year, they were either the worst or second worst interior offensive line in the league. It was them and the Giants. I forget the order. But That's how bad we're talking. And now they became a plus unit, right? And I think the idea is that doesn't get talked about enough is that any quarterback can succeed with consistently clean pockets. And if they can't, then they're not an NFL quarterback. Right. Any quarterback can also fail if he's pressured too much. You mentioned Stroud. The interior protection has kind of crumbled this year, and it hasn't been, the entire offense hasn't looked quite as good, right? So with Bryce, I think it did help him, and a lot of times I think this is overblown, but I think it did help him when Andy Dalton came in, and he had clean pockets, and he's obviously less mobile than Bryce, but he came in and played really well. And seeing how the offense is supposed to look in rhythm when Andy Dalton was in there, now Bryce Young gets to come in and see, okay, this makes sense now. If I can be protected at an NFL level, because at Alabama he was always protected, right? The biggest offensive line in the country at Alabama. Nobody could rush him. Plus he could improvise. He was better than those guys, right? You don't just walk onto an NFL field and you're better, right? You have to be protected. I've heard people say before it's a protection league. If you're not protected, nothing matters. The fact that he sat on the bench, he watched Andy Dalton do it confidently behind this offensive line. Now he goes in there and does it himself behind their O-line. It's such a big asset. And I think that's why that time off really helped him, is he could see, okay, it's possible. This O-line is better. And I think his first 2 games of the year, he still had kind of the mindset of last year where it was like, oh, man, like I'm going to get killed out here. It's going to look like last year. No one's going to separate. No one's going to block it. It's going to be a mess. These things take time. I saw the same thing with Trevor Lawrence when Doug Peterson first got there before they made that playoff run. It took Lawrence time before he really started improving his footwork and his confidence because of what happened the year before with Urban Meyer. We're kind of seeing the same thing with Bryce Young right now. Now, are you going to make the playoffs like the Jags did? No, the situation's different, but you're seeing that increased confidence from Bryce, and it comes from that. I think it comes from that time off and getting to watch Andy Dalton do it.
And I would also argue that Bryce has not, Dalton, he went to modern day high school, which is the equivalent of Alabama in its prime under Nick Saban with high school football. And then he goes under Nick Saban at Alabama. The guy didn't exactly face a lot of adversity in college and high school, even when it comes to losing games. And so he goes to the Carolina Panthers. He loses a lot of games. And I think that's has to be said, part of the adversity that Young kind of had to go through and learn that this is the NFL. This is not Alabama. This is not modern day. And you're going to lose games, and sometimes you're going to lose more than you've ever – for some of these kids, Trevor Lawrence, you just mentioned, they've ever lost in their life. And I think another reason he's getting it, like you said, is not just from that adversity, but sometimes it takes sitting back and watching a person do that example. Dave Canales can tell Bryce Young all the day, do this. But seeing Andy do it and then Andy Dalton telling him this is how you do it, and then watching him physically on the sideline do it, that can kind of help a person kind of reset. Because Bryce was never leaving Carolina. I think people think he was. Dan Morgan has talked plenty of how he feels. Other than his parents, Bryce is he's Bryce's biggest supporter. So I think their plan was always to go back to Bryce. Obviously, I think the Andy Dalton car accident, obviously, I think moved that timeline up. But the plan was always to go back to Bryce, give him a reset after a couple games, and see if that would help him going forward. And it clearly has.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you make a great point about that with Lawrence. And look, I'm a firm believer, especially with quarterbacks, that all the great ones have been through something, right? And I know Patrick Mahomes stepped in immediately, and he's been great, and he won a Super Bowl his second year as a starter and all that stuff. But very rarely is it actually like Mahomes and Brady, and that's why they might be the two best ever, right? Peyton Manning didn't win a Super Bowl until I believe his 9th year in the league. Drew Brees had a major shoulder surgery and switched teams, and Aaron Rodgers sat for 3 years behind Brett Favre and dropped in the draft and all that stuff. I mean, there's so many stories. I think about Joe Burrow got booted out of Ohio State because I think it was Justin Fields won the job over him. It's just all those guys going through adversity is a part of football. It's a part of life. It's part of playing quarterback, right? And I think we're seeing so many guys go through that. Some of them go through it in college and high school. Some go through it at the NFL level. And it's about if you can come back out on the other side. And this is why I'm really curious to see where Young goes for the last 4 games of this season, if he continues to play like this, and then what type of offseason the Panthers have, and then how he responds. Boom, week 1 coming out next year, right? This year, it was week 1. We played the Saints, I should say, and we got whacked. I mean, that's just because that's the old culture of last year that was still in there of, okay, they were afraid to go out there and play. Now, you talk about improvement. There is tangible improvement despite the lack of wins. That can build confidence, and that's just, Bryce can look back at this next year and go, that's just the adversity I had to go through to get here. And I think so many guys have been through that. Even Tom Brady's been through that. He's still mad about being a 6th-round pick, right? I mean, they've all been through something. And Bryce, you're right. Coming up, maybe a lot of things were easy, right? Number 1 quarterback in high school, number 1 quarterback in college. Now it doesn't get easy, and we find out if you can punch back, because that's what it's really about.
Yeah. Well, as we wind down here, let's talk about that offseason that you said is very vital for the Panthers this offseason. If you were running the team, Dalton, what is the blueprint for the Panthers this offseason? Because contrary to popular belief, I believe, and I think a lot of people in North Carolina would feel the same, the Panthers can compete in this division next year. This division is not, as we know, this is not the NFC North. This is the NFC South. So what do the Panthers' blueprint look like for competing in this division next season? What do they have to do this offseason? Let's call it a 3-step blueprint to get to a division winner in 2025 and even complete for the playoffs.
I think number 1 for me would be to find one more primetime weapon. I think whether that's buying it with T. Higgins or if they decide to spend a top 10 draft pick on it, say on someone like a Tepper or McMillan, I could absolutely reason with that. 2, I think I might look at the center position just to see if we have someone internal or if we need to go and find somebody to stabilize this thing, whether it's in the middle rounds of the draft or if there's somebody. I haven't looked at the free agent centers lately and who's going to be out there, but if there's an option at that spot, because I think that's a big help to glue the rest of the offensive line together, then you have a really solid 5 instead of just 4 and then an inconsistency at center. And I know there's been injuries and things like that. There's been injuries all over this team. And 3, I think on defense, and obviously you could draft a star in the 1st round. I absolutely love that too. If they go Mason Graham or Abdul Carter, something like that, great stuff. But I think you look at, to me, the Commanders' approach to how they've kind of patched together their defense this season, in that they need to go with, and Minnesota did this too, a bit of a volume approach. Let's get a handful of solid veterans to kind of raise the floor on this defense, as opposed to trying to take massive, 1 or 2 massive home run swings. I think if we get a little bit better at each spot and then we try to find our stars in the draft, I think that would help, because they have so many needs. First of all, obviously Derek Brown getting healthy, but at basically the other 10 spots, other than maybe Derek Brown and J.C. Horn, I think it's open season as far as who can win these jobs. If it's solid B to B plus veterans coming in there, if it's rookies coming in there taking starting jobs, I think it needs to be a complete overhaul. And you can't have 2 or 3 star players and then 8 holes on your defense, right? I think what Washington or even a Minnesota did a great job of is, okay, we at least don't have terrible players at any of the 11 spots on the field, except the Commanders, they working on corner, but they traded for Marshawn Lattimore later. That helps too. But I think that's the idea is let's plug as many holes with at least something as we can, as opposed to being so poor at so many spots. It's going to be, I think a more quantity approach over, I don't want to say quality because you still want quality players, but as opposed to taking a swing at the $100 million linebacker or something like that, right? If that makes sense, as just fill in spots with productive guys, as many spots as you can.
Yeah, I would argue for for your second and third point. So Cade Mays, Brady Christensen are the two internal guys that you were talking about. So Austin Corbett, my guess is the Panthers are not going to resign him coming off his third straight injury. Unfortunately, advise breaking down on if he's unfortunately, and he's a free agent. So I think it comes down to Cade Mays and Brady Christensen. I do believe they'll go in one of those two directions. One of those guys has been the sixth man, or known as the swing tackle, for the last few years. I don't think they're both are free agents, so I don't think either of them are going to want to stick around to be a swing tackle once again. So they'll probably go get paid somewhere else. I'm guessing you haven't done a lot of PFF analytic tape on Brady Christensen and Cade Mays. I think right now Cade Mays is the one starting as these last few games, but Brady Christensen also had a few of those games in which he started. Both, I think, have done pretty well for the Panthers. Hard to believe after the center position went down with Austin Corbett. Cade Mays, though, I think is the one that fits a little bit better right now at the center position. And then from your third point, I would say I agree with you with that approach. I think as far as this defense goes, though, I think another guy that might be safe is DJ Wonnum, someone who the Panthers signed for a 2-year deal and has missed half the season with a quad injury, but yet he has come on and has provided at least 3 sacks in the last few games combined, and he has done an amazing job. And just having that younger presence opposite Jadeveon Clowney when he has played has done big dividends for the secondary of guys like JC.
Yeah, I agree. Wonnum's been solid along with Clowney lately. That has been a big help for a team that has mostly struggled as a pass, on the pass rush. Is he an elite player? No, but more guys like Wonnum I would absolutely accept on this team. And Mays actually in his, in the last 5 starts has played at least solid football. So if you had to walk into, into next year with him, that would be fine. I think if you can, as always, if you're looking to upgrade your team, you look and see if there's any upgrades around. But Mays is also a young player, made the last 5 starts. I got a 69.6 pass blocking grade for him the last 5 games. That's solid. That's like starter level stuff. He's not a superstar. He's not Frank Ragnow or anything. But if that's what he can be for the duration of a whole season, I would take that absolutely. And that makes your job a lot easier when it comes to, okay, that's one less thing we have to find externally for sure.
All right. Well, as I said at the top, my guest today has been Dalton Wasserman. He is a contributor over at PFF Analyst. You can find him there, and also on the College Football Show with Max Chadwick, who has also been on this show as well. You can follow them on the PFF College Football Show. Dalton, what else and where else can we find you? Where can our listeners view your stuff, and any other things you want to promote? Anything else that you want to tell us?
Sure. PFF.com for all our great written content, and you can access all this data and our mock draft simulator, our fantasy tools, our betting tools with a PFF Plus subscription, less than $10 a month. On YouTube, the PFF College Football Show, like you mentioned, myself and Max, and I'm actually on the PFF NFL Show as well with Trevor Sikkema on Mondays, breaking down all the previous weekend's action. So any of those places you can find us, whether it's written or spoken, and we have a good time all the time breaking down the data.
Awesome. Well, last question for you, and I'll get you out the door with this. Leave our listeners, mostly Panther fans, some NFL fans in general, leave Panther fans with some hope for going out the door. What do you feel like is something the Panther fans can kind of hang their hat on these last 4 games as this season winds down and heading into an important offseason in 2025 that they can kind of hang their hat on and build upon this season that has been a little trying at times.
It has been, and it's been a trying era for them. And I think the 3 things, again, I would hang my hat on are quarterback, head coach, offensive line. Those are the 3 essential things to win in the NFL. You see the great teams have it, right? And the offensive line has come along, especially with the new guys at guard. Bryce Young has come along since the season's gone on. And I've said it out, in the offseason, I was telling people, I said it during our Panthers preview, actually, when I was previewing every team with Trevor Sikkema, was I actually, for me, Dave Canales, outside of Jim Harbaugh, because he was kind of his own category, Dave Canales was my favorite hire of this past offseason. I love the way he ran the offense in Tampa. I love just the way it was, okay, listen, we're underdogs, and I have Baker Mayfield, and we have some flaws on this team, but we're going to find a way to score points anyway. We're going to find a way to run the ball. We're going to find a way to throw the ball. Everything about Dave Canales, I just really liked. I think it was an underrated hire at the time. I think it's still paying dividends right now, despite the record. I think he's a guy to stick with that can get Bryce where he wants, where he needs him to be. So I really like your head coach. I like the way your quarterback is progressing, and I like how this offensive line is with those veterans on the inside. If you have those three things, you can have success. Now you just got to build around it.
Well, that's a good place to leave it. Dalton Wasserman from PFF has been our guest today here on Inside the Vault. Dalton, all the best. We'll have to have you on again down the road, and we'll talk to you later.
Absolutely. Appreciate you having me on, Ryan.
And that'll wrap up this episode of Inside the Vault, episode number 55. Rate, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcast, and we will see you next time.